Chapter 2, Literature Review. Introduction. The purpose of the study is to understand the experiences of an art teacher implementing art education with creative learning principles to cultivate students' creative self-efficacy and divergent thinking at one middle school in the Inland Empire located in Southern California. Art is defined as visual and performing arts, which includes dance, media arts, music, theater, and visual arts. The focus of the study is visual arts. Creative learning principles incorporates higher order thinking to solve complex tasks by evaluating and analyzing a given problem to create a solution. An art education that incorporates creative learning principles creates a hands-on approach to learning while students find solutions to problems that utilize higher order thinking. In an art education that incorporates creative learning principles, students explore experimentation and divergent thinking through project-based learning. In art, students are encouraged to find individual solutions to the same problem and express their individuality. As students share their solutions, experiment, and recreate artwork through multiple renditions, students have the potential to actively gain self-efficacy as the students attempt to achieve the desired outcome of their artwork. Self-efficacy is a student's ability to develop confidence and competence in their ability to achieve the desired outcome. Self-efficacy is an individual's ability to continue to strive towards a goal even when mistakes and failing occur. Self-efficacy is essential when students are learning academic content for the first time and students who might not initially grasp the content in other school disciplines. Self-efficacy is important because students can get discouraged if they do not understand the content, or students can be too embarrassed by appearing incompetent in front of their peers to ask teachers for assistance. Divergent thinking is a student's ability to think differently from one another, think through solutions, opinions, and ability to justify a decision. In contrast, schools often use a banking model to transfer education. In the banking model, students receive histories or truths from education institutions that are deemed appropriate and necessary to be taught to students. The banking model transfers information from one generation to the next. When students are learning the same content through general education, students may benefit from opportunities for divergent thinking. Divergent thinking will allow students to develop their individuality and creativity. Although there are objectively accepted answers in standardized pre-K-12 curriculum in math, English, and science, this leaves few opportunities for divergent thinking. Teachers are instructed by education administrators to meet the benchmarks, curriculum, and objective requirements initially expected to prepare students for high-stakes testing. As a result of prioritizing high-stakes standardized testing, teachers do not have many opportunities to engage students' divergent thinking. While subjects such as math, English, and science are essential, sub-subject areas are taught to satisfy the requirement of high-stakes standardized testing and are not conducive to divergent thinking. Society expects most students to learn the same information and to take the same high-stakes test with little differentiation. Self-efficacy and divergent thinking are both developed through the process of making art. The intent of this research is to understand the experiences of students and identify how students can continually develop their self-efficacy and divergent thinking through an art education that incorporates creative learning principles. The significance of the study would be to highlight how an emphasis on core content standards and high-stakes testing have stagnated student self-efficacy and divergent thinking because of the lack of art education that incorporates creative learning principles. The significance of students cultivating self-efficacy and divergent thinking would be to become critically conscious through art education. History of high-stakes testing. Prioritizing standardized responses. While standardized testing has been used in the United States since the 1800s, it was never mandatory to receive school funding. Politics, corporations, and education have become more interrelated and often do more harm to low-income people and communities of color. Standardized testing was first implemented to ensure that students were learning content that was grade level appropriate. Standardized testing, which was originally designed to measure what students have learned, has become high-stakes testing that determines how schools are funded. Funding for schools is dependent on teachers effectively improving student academic achievement and for students to perform high on standardized tests. Both the Nixon and Reagan administrations began to call for education reform so that the mandated curriculum would be in the best interest of corporations and policymakers. Then, continuing with the George W. Bush and Barack Obama administrations, many of the corporations worked together with education policymakers to determine which discipline and which assessments would allow the U.S. to compete economically on a global market. As the U.S. continues to be dependent on high-stakes testing to assess the performance of student learning, students are not performing better on state assessments, nor is the U.S. outperforming other countries in reading, writing, and math. Since implementing No Child Left Behind, the U.S. reading, writing, and math scores have dropped when compared to other countries' test scores. No Child Left Behind became the framework from 2002 to 2015 for standardized testing for schools throughout the United States to assess students' performance based on standards believed by the federal government to further education and career paths. Under NCLB, Title I funding for schools depended on student academic performance, standardized test scores, and teachers' ability to help students meet the standards. Obama introduced Common Core State Standards in 2009, which would grant states the right to determine which standards met the needs of their students, even though the government still designed the standards to prepare for standardized testing. Under CCSS, the states needed to incorporate state standards and administer standardized testing to continue receiving federal grant money, but have the autonomy to choose which standards to implement. NCLB and CCSS were implemented to satisfy the education and skill requirements that educators, policymakers, and corporations believe that students should have in order to prepare students for further education and to create jobs in the U.S. More than a decade after NCLB and CCSS curriculum have been implemented, the corporations that promised to bring jobs to the U.S. if the curriculum was implemented have gone to other countries that have lower taxes, lower work environment standards, and are able to pay employees lower wages. For corporations, the interest has shifted from providing jobs to students with high test scores to shifting jobs to other countries that have employees willing to work for less due to globalization and automation. Many corporations have moved higher-paying jobs overseas, even though NCLB and CCSS were developed in partnership between the government and corporations to prepare students to meet the qualifications needed to work for these corporations. Even after corporations have moved these jobs overseas, the government has not reformed educational policies and standards to leave out the interests of the corporations. As a result of reforming education to implement NCLB and CCSS in order to satisfy corporations, students in the U.S. are scoring lower on high-stakes tests than before the reformed curriculum, leading to students falling further behind in education and being less prepared for further education and future careers. In 2009, Obama also implemented the Race to the Top grant that rewarded schools that performed well academically. Instead, the RTTT grant incentivized schools to cheat on standardized tests, attendance records, and reports to receive funding. As a result, schools in lower socioeconomic communities that needed the funding to perform well began to perform worse. Instead, RTTT made it possible for private charter schools to receive funding and consequently closed more public schools. RTTT, NCLB, CCSS, and standardized testing all brought forward inequities in education and achievement gaps for students from different socioeconomic backgrounds. In 2015, Obama replaced NCLB with the Every Student Succeeds Act, which allowed flexibility to Title I funding to rely less on students' academic and teachers' performance. ESSA allocates Title I funding based on the school local control and accountability plans that school districts develop to meet their students' unique needs. Title I funding is based on a formula that looks at census information based on poverty estimates, families who receive assistance, supported foster homes, neglected or delinquent children with low attendance. Title I are federal funds that support the educational needs of students through effective evidence-based educational strategies that close the achievement gap and enable the students to meet the state's challenging academic standards. The current forms of funding for K-12 public school districts in California are Title I and LCAP. Still, the art classes were already eliminated prior to the implementation of ESSA to focus on students' preparation for standardized testing. Interpretations of the effectiveness of high-stakes tests to measure students' knowledge of grade-level appropriate content varies when comparing test scores in the U.S. from when NCLB was implemented in 2002 to 2017. Results show that students were already able to meet grade-level appropriate content prior to the implementation of high-stakes tests, while policymakers argue that 15 years is not long enough to show the effectiveness of high-stakes tests to measure student knowledge. Some results of NCLB state that scores of students were unchanged, which means that students were able to learn grade-level appropriate content before high-stakes tests were implemented as a measurement tool for success. Other sources state that further research needs to be conducted to determine if high-stakes tests is helping. The results of high-stakes tests from 2002 to 2017 show that high-stakes tests were not more successful in measuring students' knowledge of grade-level appropriate content prior to when high-stakes tests were implemented. Effects of high-stakes testing on defining success. The United States uses standardized tests to measure student achievement. When students score high on standardized tests, those scores are perceived as measuring their success in career and college readiness. If a student does not score high on the standardized test, that is a perceived indicator of the student's failure to be prepared for a career in college. If students received high scores for memorizing pre-existing formulas and were able to recall how to solve problems for a test, that student would be considered an example of a high-achieving student. Although many states have made many attempts in opting out of standardized tests, New York is the only state that was successful in 2016 to opt out of standardized testing. Parents in New York recognized how standardized testing was unfairly being prioritized for funding, and as a result, school programs in their state were being defunded. Since New York is the only state that opts out of standardized testing, it is essential to look at other countries who recognize our education as a resource to prepare students for higher education and future careers. Many countries, including Norway, Iceland, Switzerland, Denmark, and Finland, have started moving away from focusing and measuring a country's success based on how well students perform on national state tests. These same countries have also moved away from evaluating country success based on GDP, income, investment, capitalism, and global markets. Instead, these countries have begun focusing on prosperity, innovation, and social progress. It is only until high school that students in California are expected to take one course of art. Thank you for watching the video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. And feel free to watch any of the other related videos.